Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So this series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hey everyone, Jody here. Over the next week, the next 4 episodes, we're bringing you 4 of our favorite conversations from this past year. Maybe you've heard them, maybe you haven't, but we're taking this week off. Hopefully you are getting a little downtime as well. And then we will be back in 2021. Tuesday, the 5th of January is our first new episode of the year. On behalf of everyone at the show, Happy New Year. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, July 23rd, 1890, Wyoming is celebrating their newly won statehood. Wyoming had become the 44th state earlier in the month, and here's what's interesting about this day, the 23rd. On this day, a woman by the name of Teresa Jenkins was invited to deliver the keynote speech at the statehood celebration, and Jenkins was, among other things, a strong advocate for women's right to vote. This was a big part of Wyoming's identity at the time. The Wyoming Territory had already granted women the right to vote for about 20 years, and they made keeping that right to vote a precondition for joining the Union. So this is our chance to talk about Wyoming, the rocky road towards women's suffrage, and this larger question of why it was the territories that sometimes seem to be at the forefront of this issue. I am joined, as always, by Nicole Hemmer of Columbia. Hello, Niki.
Hey, Jody.
And back with us is Maeve Higgins of the New York Times and the podcast Mothers of Invention and many other wonderful things. Hello, Maeve.
Hi, Jody. I haven't been to Wyoming, so I feel a
You
little
haven't?
fraudulent.
How many states have you been to, Maeve?
I think maybe around 8 out of, however many there are, 20 or something.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, your math checks out. So let me rephrase that. Your accent checks out.
That's right.
I have been to all 50 states. Nicole?
Really?
Oh, yeah.
I have been to Wyoming. I've been to Jackson Hole. Although I will say, while you two were talking, I had to figure out if Jackson Hole was in Wyoming, so I can't say that it left a huge impression on me as a state.
It has left a big impression on me. It's beautiful. And the Wyoming State Capitol building is one of my favorite Capitol buildings in the country. It is beautiful. And they have this celebration, Frontier Days, every year, which is one of the best sort of celebrations in the country. So I would
Are we allowed
recommend
to bully you, even though this is your podcast? But
yes.
Who has a favorite state capitol building?
Well.
What young man in the world?
What non-Leslie Knope person has a favorite?
Well, this is where I confess. We're getting a little off track here, but this is where I confess that one of the reasons I've been to all 50 states is because a friend of mine and I did a project in which the project was to go to all 50 state capitals in 50 days. And
was this a voluntary thing, or you were being paid by somebody?
It was a voluntary thing. My friend Webster did it. He did all 50, and I was the gopher man. And so when he flew to Alaska and then flew back, I drove the car from Oregon to Montana, and so I hit 30, upper 30s on that trip. He hit all 50, and then I've sort of rounded it out otherwise. But I've seen a lot of state capitals, and Wyoming is up there. And we're going to get back on track here, Maeve, despite the bullying on my own podcast. But look, this question of who had the right to vote, which state had the right to vote, Niki, I mean, it gets a little tricky because states like New Jersey had granted women the right to vote very early on, and then they rescinded it. But, basically there is an argument to be made that Wyoming was kind of the first state to have women's suffrage baked in, and it has existed since then. So why Wyoming?
So a big part of it has to do with the fact that it was the frontier, and so it didn't have these kind of hardened laws in place. I mean, New Jersey is a great example that women and other people had more rights earlier on in U.S. history than they had later on in U.S. history as the country kind of hardens into a white male electorate. And so out there in the territories, you can do anything you want, including giving women the right to vote, which they did in part, by the way, to attract more women out there because men outnumbered women 6-1 in Wyoming and in other places on the frontier.
Did that help? Did that like attract more women?
You know, that's a really great question. I don't know that it actually did, but it seems sound to me. Like if I knew that I could get like greater political rights, I might consider visiting Wyoming more often.
Yeah, and actually there's other elements here too. I mean, there was even like sort of an equal pay law on the books, and women were allowed to married women were allowed to have property separate from their husbands. But I think, Niki, to your larger point, like as is often the case with civil rights, the like practical explanation is usually more on target than the like high-minded, we care about actual core fundamental rights explanation.
Right. I mean, this happens with companies all the time, right? That they become more liberal in their policies in order to attract more people. And it's crazy, right? Because you know that here Wyoming knows in the 19th century that the way to attract women is to treat them equally. And it takes the rest of the country quite a while to catch up.
I mean, does that just mean that those, like, to put it crudely, like those incentive structures didn't exist back east in the non-territories?
Yeah, I mean, there was no reason that those states had to give their women citizens those rights. So they didn't until they were forced to much later on.
Let's talk about this character sort of at the heart of this, Teresa Jenkins, who's really fascinating. She gives this speech. She was a proponent of women's suffrage. I think she had a real kind of role in making this an issue within Wyoming. One of the things that's really fascinating about her is, when we think of suffragettes and we think of the abolitionist movement and we think of like a lot of, we talked about Sojourner Truth on this podcast, and we think of them as sort of like rabble rousers, and she was really portrayed in a really different way. She was portrayed almost as kind of genteel, which is a sort of interesting thing to think of as for someone who's like taking such a radical stand.
Yeah, it's just a form of respectability politics, right? This idea that she's not a wild-eyed feminist who's going to like wear pants or something. She's doing this out of a sense of motherhood and care for home, and that actually infuses a lot of the suffragist movement. There's certainly a wing of it that says, give us the right to vote because we are going to bring reform and we're going to bring kind of a high-mindedness and a care for home into the public sphere to make politics less corrupt and better.
Was that a tactic, or did they genuinely feel that way?
I think many of them genuinely felt that way. I mean, in the progressive era in particular, like at the turn of the 20th century, there was this committed belief that women actually, because of their experiences as mothers and people who took care of the home, would bring that same kind of spirit to politics and clean politics up.
I wonder sometimes about, I don't know if people are getting, like if their agency is being erased by kind of saying, oh, it's practicality that moved the civil rights movements forward or whatever. Or if it's like, well, no, they were working for many years and many lifetimes and like it was driving them crazy, but they got it done in the end. Like it's hard for me to understand where the line is.
Yeah, and remember, these are movements with so many people with so many different motives in so many different places across the country. And what works in Wyoming is going to look very different from like Atlanta or New York. And I think that's the other important element here, right? Jody, you asked why Wyoming. Wyoming is almost entirely white. I think there were 10 black women who were able to vote thanks to this law because there were only 10 black women over 21 who lived in the entire state. And that's really important, too, because within the women's suffrage movement, it was often white women who were at the fore and who were often, particularly in the South, but in other places, saying, give us the right to vote, rather than giving it to black men who had been stripped of that right more or less in the South, and rather than giving it to black women.
And wasn't there Native Americans in Wyoming at that time?
There were indeed, and they were kept out of this as well. So American Indians still weren't eligible to vote. And in fact, they wouldn't get full voting rights in all of the states until the 1950s.
Oh my God.
Yeah, it was really late.
we got to start to wrap it up because we wasted so much time with Maeve bullying me at the top of the show.
Worth it. Agreed.
But no, I actually want to come back to this sort of question, Maeve, that you brought up about the story of how progress gets made, because I think it's something I've been thinking about a lot now in this moment, particularly with George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, and how the story of this moment will get written, and whether we run the risk of it being written as, a bunch of companies realized it was important to be on the side of movements because there was a capitalistic motive there,
right.
incentive there, or whether we will recognize the actual hard work being done.
I suppose it's like, as a historian, Niki has probably got a better read on it, but it's like, who gets to tell the story at the end of the day? And then it's interesting to see it like being parsed through again and understanding. And like, thank goodness that there's still all the elders in the movement who can tell us what really went on in the 50s and 60s. Like, they're still alive today. So I think paying attention to who's talking and who's telling the story, that's what helps me to figure it out anyway.
Yeah, I mean, this year is the anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which recognized women's right to vote. And the way that story has changed over time, and the way that it's told, from like high political history to focusing on white suffragists to, I think this year, focusing on who was excluded and who else was fighting for broader rights. We're in a good moment where historians in particular are focusing on the people of a movement, but there's still a much fuller story to be told.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I think it's like something we've touched on the show a number of times, and I've been thinking about a lot, but you can almost mark the kind of nature of a present moment by how it talks about history. And I think there's a lot of encouraging signs now that mark kind of how significant of a moment this is.
I love the idea of like this little Mrs. Jenkins being all calm and making an apple pie, and then like literally like declaring herself a feminist at the same time. That's exciting.
Yeah. While living in a beautiful state that you should visit someday.
God, he's about to offer us a guided tour. No thanks, Jody. I like shopping malls. Good luck.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Oh, no, shoot. I wanted to do one other thing. I do want to sneak in one also on this day. And mostly, Niki, I think this is a reminder for us to do this at some point in the future, because this is the anniversary in 2009 of the Beer Summit, which was, what do you want to give? Yeah. Oh, Maeve, you don't know what the Beer Summit was? No. We have lots of things to say. We will do a proper episode, but Niki, give the sketch real quick.
The quick sketch is that a prominent African-American historian was arrested for breaking into his own home by a white police officer. Oh. The president of the United States, Barack Obama, said that the police behaved stupidly, and people got so mad at him that he had to invite everyone over for beers at the White House.
And to my mind, and I think Niki too, this is one of the kind of overlooked critical moments in recent history, and certainly in the course of Barack Obama's presidency. So yeah, we will find a hook and do an episode about the Beer Summit at some point.
Awesome.
All right, Nicole Hammer, thank you as always.
Thanks, Jody.
And Maeve Higgins, thanks to you. And despite your rabble-rousing, we will invite you back for one more episode after this. But thanks for doing this.
Sorry to make you cry.
That's the end of this episode. This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of the Radiotopia Network. You can find us online at This Day Pod. Please remember to leave us a rating and a review in the Apple Store or wherever you listen to your podcast. Those really do help others find out about the show when you give us nice ratings and reviews. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Coming up on Sunday, as I said, Maeve will be back, and we'll be talking about a very fraught and controversial and potentially conspiratorial scandal, the Chappaquiddick accident. That'll be this Sunday. My name is Jody Avergan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.